Welcome everybody to this evening's webinar. Just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and also just a warning that some of the issues that we'll be discussing this evening may be upsetting to hear, and we've provided some links to support services in the chat box on the right hand side of your screen. Unfortunately, I've just received an email from Jess Phillips to say that they will be joining us a little bit later this evening. The votes have been called later than they were expecting, and I guess that's one of the perils of having serving MPs on your panel. Their work is seemingly never done. My name is Anna Hopkins, and I work at the Open University as a lecturer and a researcher, and one of my passions in life is thinking about how we can reduce gender-based violence, for me specifically domestic abuse. I've worked in this area for many years, both as a police officer and a researcher, and that is how this webinar has come about this evening, where I decided to organise it. This webinar on how politicians can contribute towards reducing gender-based violence has been organised to coincide with the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which was an initiative that was set up by the United Nations in 1991. Since then, a lot has changed, and a lot continues to change in terms of how we see gender-based violence, how we work with it. Yet, despite these numerous changes and developments, we are still faced with the fact that 1 in 3 women will experience physical and sexual violence globally. And in the UK, a woman is killed every 3 days by domestic violence. So I hope that this webinar can assist us in understanding what can be done on this issue from a political perspective, both from a national and local point of view, and what the plans hold for future work in this area. And on that note, I would like to invite the panellists to return next year during the 2022 16 Days of Activism, if they would be willing to do that. I think it would be great to provide us with some continuity on this debate, which I think is very important moving forward. So I'd like to start by introducing the co-host of the seminar, which is Simon Usherwood. Simon is a professor in politics and international studies, and he has very kindly, here at Open University, and he's very kindly offered to help me co-host this webinar. So thank you, Simon. And I'm delighted to introduce to you the 2 panellists that we do have with us so far this evening. The first one to introduce is the Right Honourable Anne Milton, who is former Member of Parliament for Guildford and previously Minister for Women in 2017 to 18. And we also have Dr. Shahar Ali, I think. Hi, Shahar. And Dr. Shahar Ali is the Green Party spokesperson for policing and domestic safety. As I said, hopefully we'll have Jess Phillips joining us. Jess Phillips, as I think most of you will know, is Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding, and also MP for Birmingham Yardley. And we also have...
She's just arrived, Anna.
Oh, amazing. Are you with us, Jess?
I'm just trying to get her into the meeting. One moment, please.
No worries. I will just explain quickly to the audience. In terms of an online webinar, we would like you really to engage the panellists with some challenging and thought-provoking questions. And we do that on an online webinar, for those of you who don't know, by asking questions in the chat box. If you could type your questions in the chat box, and also just to say, if you see any questions that you particularly like and would like to be asked to the panellists, if you could hover over that question and you'll see a range of emojis. If you click on the thumbs up, and then that will help us to choose which of the questions to ask the panellists. The question with the most thumbs up has an increased chance of being asked. It's kind of all about thumbs up on an online webinar, it seems. Do we have Jess and Wira?
Hopefully that's Jess.
Hi, Jess.
Hiya, sorry, we were running from the vote.
Oh, well done. Was it a long run?
It's quite a long run, yeah.
Bless. Thank you for joining us. I've just been introducing the webinar and I'm about to, I've mentioned who you are, not that people will need to be reminded of that, but I've introduced you. So if you could just start by introducing yourself and the work that you do in this area of gender-based violence, if that's okay.
No problems. So, as has been said, I'm Jess Phillips, and aside from leading the Labour Party's front bench response to tackling violence against women and girls, or male violence against women, or gender-based violence, whatever you want to call it, I have been a campaigner, and I worked for Women's Aid for many years, have run female offenders centres, worked in women's prisons, run rape crisis services, and have been campaigning around the issue of violence against women and girls in all of its forms for many, many years. And yeah, I lead the Labour Party's response on that.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jess. Anne, would you like to go next?
Yes, thanks very much, Anna. Pleasure to be here. I'm a good friend of Jess Phillips, actually. I spent 14 years as an MP, Minister for Women. I chaired the all-party group on women, peace and security, which do Google if you want to know more about it. I worked as a nurse, spent 25 years working in the health service, and I spent this brief period of time in politics. And this has always been an issue that's mattered to me. It's never got enough attention. The role of Minister for Women, I think, is always a bit of an afterthought for any government. When they do reshuffles, be they in opposition or in government, it tends to be they appoint everybody and then they think, oh yes, and who's going to be Minister for Women? So it never gets the attention it should do, and that is despite the excellent efforts of people like Jess.
Thank you very much, Anne. Do we have Wera Hobhouse in the room yet, or in the space?
I'm afraid we don't, Anna.
Okay, then I would like to move on to Dr. Shahar Ali. If you could introduce yourself and the work that you do in this area.
Thanks, Anna. Firstly, it's a great honour to be amongst such experienced campaigners. I'm the policing and domestic safety spokesperson for the Green Party, and there is so much going on now in terms of legislation. There's the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, we've had the Domestic Abuse Bill, there's an online harms bill, and women really are and have been front and centre on the impact of bad legislation. And so I, as any human being, am moved by trying to overcome and do whatever I can to overcome the injustice that women are facing on a daily basis. It is a scourge in our society. The Greens in particular have been campaigning to make misogyny a hate crime. We might have more to say about that a bit later, but I'm really looking forward to the debate and a cross-party political tinge to this debate. I think is very necessary.
Thank you, Shahar. Sorry, just to check once more, do we have Wera yet? No Wera?
No, sorry.
No, okay. So I am now honoured to also introduce you to Julie Aunger. Julie, are you there?
I'm here. Hello.
Hi. It's brilliant for you to join us this evening, Julie. Julie is here to talk about her losing her daughter, Katie, to domestic homicide. And I will be returning. Sorry, I just want to ask you what it's like to live with the reality of gender-based violence, given what happened to Katie in the weeks prior to her murder taking place, and what you feel needs to happen in this area.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for the invite. You've only given me 5 minutes, and anyone who knows me knows how difficult I find it to stop talking, especially about Katie. So I'm going to jump straight into her story first, if I may, to give you a bit of background. In early 2015, my youngest daughter, Katie Wilding, met a man when she was just 19 and he was 31 years old. She genuinely believed that she loved this man with all of her heart, and she believed loved her deeply. But just after 17 months, after he'd controlled her life completely, he found a small piece of newspaper which showed some flats to let and realized that she was trying to leave him. He beat her repeatedly and threatened to throw himself off their third floor flat if she left. The neighbours called the police and he was arrested. He was released on conditional police bail and we moved her out, but he found her 2 days later and held her against her will for 36 hours, beating her over and over again. At one point, he gave her his phone and said, "Call the police." She started to dial and he told her that he would kill her before they arrived and then kill every police officer who came through the door. He was arrested again and pled guilty to 2 counts of beating, criminal damage and resisting arrest at Plymouth Magistrates Court the following morning. We were told the charges of holding her against her will and threats to kill her were dropped by the CPS, as they said it would be easier for Katie in the long run. They could prove the physical harm by the bruises and the cuts that she had. He was released on the same conditional bail as the previous week and given a sentencing date of the 28th of November 2016. Katie had never given evidence against him before, but she said that he'd gone too far this time and that she was scared he was going to kill her. He was released on exactly the same conditional bail, even though he broke all of his bail conditions only just 5 days before. She was being supported by the domestic violence police team and they fitted a panic alarm for her. She was given a high-risk assessment from the MARAC team, who only look at the most dangerous of cases. But sadly, none of this saved my daughter from this evil man, and just a month after she had found the courage to leave him, on the 14th of November 2016. They were both found dead at his flat just 4 weeks after he told me he could easily kill her with drugs and we'd never prove it. Just 4 weeks after he told me if he couldn't have her, then nobody could. His first words to Katie were, "I've been watching you." Within 2 weeks of meeting her, he told her he loved her. Within 3 to 4 weeks of them meeting, he told her he was being evicted and asked if he could move in with her just for a few weeks until he sorted himself out. And it was at this point that he admitted he had an electronic tag fitted after being convicted of a violent crime. During the 17-month relationship, Katie would often come and stay with us for the night just to get away from his abuse and violence. She'd phone to ask if she could stay, as in her words, he'd be escalating, usually after he'd been drinking. And when she arrived, he would either physically have hurt her or spat at her, but always would have verbally, mentally and emotionally abused her. He said he loved Katie and he wanted to protect her. I said I felt she needed protected from him and he laughed and said I was probably right. Katie's police video statement is where she tells of the many times he'd hit her, the black eye he gave her for her 21st birthday, the times he'd tried to strangle her, that he was always spitting at her, that he checked her phone constantly, that he accused her of seeing other men. She gave so many examples of coercive control in her witness statement, isolating her from her friends and family, monitoring her phone with a tracking device, threats to post intimate photos and videos online. She was found dead next to this violent man just 4 weeks later, with all of her own evidence ignored, along with all of the history of the violence and abuse and the threats to kill Katie. At our inquest, the coroner found that the police had carried out a poor investigation into the death of my daughter and stated that assumptions were made as to the cause of Katie's death. We made a complaint against the police and had 4 out of 5 of our criticisms upheld, but the most important were the police carried out a poor investigation into Katie's death and that the lead officers were not aware of all of the facts and evidence and did not take statements from key witnesses. And sadly, this is the reality of gender-based violence and sadly, therefore, gender-based homicide. When I spoke at a conference run by an amazing charity, AFTER, which stands for Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, I told Katie's story in much more detail. There's a lot to tell. A senior police officer from the Metropolitan Police approached me afterwards and apologised for the way Katie's death was handled, stated it sounded like a police investigation from the 1980s, when gender-based domestic violence was classed as exactly that, domestic, and not really something for the police to be involved in. Within weeks of Mitchell moving in with my daughter, he started to smash up the flat. Her landlord was told, and she said to Katie that if it didn't stop, she would be evicted. Katie had had a perfect relationship with her landlord until this point. This was an opportunity for the landlord to take Katie to one side and ask if she was okay. Now, people are going to tell me this isn't the landlord's responsibility, and legally they're right, but what about morally? Katie was a young, vulnerable 19-year-old woman. Should we as a community be more willing to ask the simple question, are you okay? In their second flat, her neighbours only called the police when they were afraid for her life, when the volume and intensity of the violence could not be ignored. They admitted that they had heard him shouting and Katie crying and screaming on multiple occasions. Oh, but they were such a lovely couple. He was so protective of her. They simply couldn't believe he was capable of gender-based violence. He was such a big man and she was tiny, and it was so obvious that he loved her. After Katie and Mitchell were found dead, his friends and family took to social media, and the comments included things like, I hope you find peace now, Mitchell. It was well known that he was an angry, violent man, but people just seemed to accept that that was a part of him. These same people refused to believe that he had hurt Katie. And even when it became public knowledge that he had pleaded guilty to 2 counts of beating her, they just seemed to shrug it off as, well, it's Mitchell being Mitchell. Why were they not horrified that their friend, their son, their brother was someone who could beat a defenseless young woman 12 years younger and so much smaller than him? If we see someone we know who is usually bright and bubbly become withdrawn and subdued, why are we not asking if all is well? Let's stop brushing gender-based violence and homicide under the carpet. Let's start to make it more difficult for perpetrators to hide behind closed doors by not being afraid to talk about it. Let's give victims safe places to go to ask for help. Let's stop allowing the world we live in to blame the girls and the women who are terrified day in and day out when we ask, why don't you just leave? There is so much more in Katie's story that proves to me that little has changed over the last decades, even though there's been a lot of talking, and I am so fed up with hearing that lessons will be learnt. And yet there are new Katies appearing in our headlines every day. Over the past few months, there have been some really high-profile cases where women have been taken from our streets. Now more than ever is the time to change. Please, let's work together to try and save future vulnerable Katies. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I'd just like to take a moment of silence to remember Katie. Thanks, Julie, for sharing that. I think it's really, really important that in this setting we have that personal context to understand gender-based violence, domestic homicide from, and it's the story makes us realise just how much work is still to be done, both from a political point of view, from a policing point of view, but also from a societal point of view of shifting that focus from, you know, it was a private matter, now it's a public matter, but yet it's still a private matter because we don't want to interfere, we don't want to cause unnecessary annoyance or interference. But I'm really, really grateful for you sharing your story with us. Thank you. Just also a reminder that there are links in the chat box for support services should anyone wish to have a look at those. I'm going to be asking some questions to the panelists now, but please remember to ask your questions in the chat box for the Q&A session that will follow shortly afterwards. So I'm going to ask my first question to Jess, and then I'm going to direct them to the other panelists. Please do remember that we are short on time. So Jess, what in your opinion would a cross-party approach look like for you, and what are the barriers to such an approach? You need to unmute yourself.
I thought I had done that. You'd think we'd learnt by now, but we haven't. First and foremost, I think that it's important to say that there is a cross-party approach to much of this. In fact, you know, if most of the legislation that has been passed in the past 10 years, in a time, especially I mean, one of the reasons it took a cross-party approach is because of small majorities and hung parliaments definitely help cross-party approaches without question. But there is no political party. There is not even factions within political parties anymore that don't care about this and wouldn't have listened aghast in horror to the series, not even just the story of Katie's death, but the series of failures that were both before and after she had been murdered. So the reality is that much of this work happens in a very collegiate and consensus-driven way. The thing that is a barrier to it is the difference between temporary short-term potential fixes and whole-scale structural change. And one of the main barriers, I have to say, around violence against women and girls in all of its forms, but even if you just took domestic violence and domestic homicide as an example, is the volume. The volume is so great that for any political movement to actually commit what is needed, so in the case of Katie, like proper management and monitoring of, I'm going to do this in inverted commas, low-level offenders to stop escalation, would be a resource that no political party is actually can contemplate how big an issue that is. So if you think about other sort of harmful crime types, your county lines, your terrorism, your high risk of harm crime types in this space, what you're talking about on a weekly basis is 5 cases versus 500 cases. And the volume makes it so that politicians will try and go, well, we need this bit of legislation that means it's easier for you to get housing, and we need this little bit of legislation that means it's easier, that will make it a policing priority, which incidentally it isn't currently, and we need this change in regulation to make sure that there's more refuge accommodation, and all of these things in and of themselves will basically handle the harm rather than prevent the problem. And the fundamental problem is that we don't manage and monitor offenders. We don't do anywhere near enough in the space of offender management, really decent prevention at an early age, and then management of offenders, because there are too many offenders. And so when you try and do an offender management program, I've tried to do them, and we had a certain amount of money, and then it cohorts down. So you go, okay, well, there's 8,000 offenders in this pilot area that we're going to do this year. So, okay, we've got enough money for 100 of them. So we'll make it the most high risk of harm, the MARAC that Julie referred to. So we restrict on the basis of risk, which is dynamic and changes, rather than on the basis of need. And so we say, okay, we'll go to the most high risk cohort. Now we've got 700 people in that category. Okay, we'll go to those that have a child protection plan. And all the while you are chipping away at some of the women, most of the women that you're going to protect. And until we have almost a royal commission where we all sit down and say there is systematic failure in this area and nobody is innocent of the systematic failures over the years, and sit down and actually look at what systematically it's going to cost. Cost is always the reason why politicians don't work together. Where are you going to get the money from? And we spend 66 billion on the harm currently, so I'll have half of that. It'd be nice. The reality is that until we all sit down and admit that this is a priority problem and the biggest problem, then I'm afraid to say it doesn't matter how much we get on with each other or like each other or all agree that it's bad. It simply won't change.
Yes, I agree with a lot of what you're saying there. In fact, I agree with everything that you're saying. And anything that you would like to add to what Jess said?
I mean, agree with everything Jess has said. The cross-party thing is not an issue. There is agreement. It's just about where it comes on everybody's priority list. That's where there's disagreement, actually. I don't blame Julie for being really angry at the phrase lessons will be learnt. I mean, the problem for Julie's daughter is that she was failed at every stage in the process. I would focus a lot more on the prevention. And I think politicians do have a role to play. I think that we need to see real leadership on this, combating male attitudes to women. I mean, gender equality is an issue in here that sits behind a lot of this. So notwithstanding all the problems that Jess has outlined about the costs involved in addressing this properly, it's got to go up the list of priorities. So when people say we do care, my response will be, well, you don't care enough, because otherwise you would be spending more money on it. But the prevention side of it, so cultural shifts in attitudes to what we accept and what is reasonable to accept from young boys and girls, but it goes both ways, is really, really important. And I don't think we have done enough work on that. So misogyny as a hate crime is just the start of it. I think they've been doing that in Nottingham. But actually it goes right back, working with families where violence is a means of resolving conflict. All that sort of work will all contribute to stopping, in this case, young men growing up to be older men who really can have control.
Thank you, and yeah, I agree that prevention is key also in this area. Education, I think, can play a much bigger role in that as well. Shahar, what are your thoughts on what's been said so far?
So, I mean, you will get a rash of commonality amongst us for sure. And I wanted to start by saying, since we're talking about cross-party political, how moved I was by a foreword by Jess, actually, in a book which is probably longer, probably feels like a long time ago, a book, My Own Story by Emmeline Pankhurst. You may recall you wrote an introduction to that. And it was really moving, actually. It was personal, deeply personal story. And I think, you know, I mean, I'm not in politics to be party political anyway. For me, it's all about results for sure, and it's about overcoming injustice. And when you look at the injustice, it's tremendous. And you know, it's excruciatingly painful to hear Julie's story and all those families who are afflicted by this male violence upon women. And what we have to do is come together as politicians, and there will be differences of opinion in legislation. There are. I mean, I would say, partly as a Green, that universal credit, for example, damages women disproportionately because it impacts them disproportionately, because it reinforces economic equality without really dealing root and branch with some of the challenges that women face disproportionately in work. And that's a social attitude, because maybe they have greater responsibility, and why should that be, for childcare, and yet they can't afford it, or their contract is insecure. So we have to deal root and branch with prevention before we get to policing and prisons, which are themselves totally inadequate. And there are plenty of statistics. It's a bit like on the lessons learned strategy, isn't it? There's no end of independent, whatever that means, reports telling us that we're not doing enough. We've seen a 35% drop in convictions for domestic violence in the last 5 years. So clearly there is not the level of commitment required. As Jess has said, it's not a strategic priority. It's not up there with terrorism. And yet we have seen very recently in Plymouth, the Plymouth mass, I think, call a thing by its proper name. He was a mass murderer. The person who was inspired by incel ideology, involuntary celibacy, that underworld of disgusting ideology that people consume in the internet. So I think we have to look not just at raising the status of domestic abuse and violence against women as see it on our streets, as we'd had in Plymouth. We have to make sure that those crimes are classifiable also as terroristic when they are, because I think that kind of hatred of women is terroristic and should be treated with the resource that's required. And finally, we've seen the police, unfortunately, becoming a problem. So there's an absence of trust. Even the Everard inquiry, so to speak, does not have sufficient teeth to actually call witnesses and to make sure that we can produce results. And so there won't even be sufficient lessons to learn from in that case. And we've seen a culture, finally, of misogyny and sexism in the force. There's been the police have been put under a microscope, and rightly so, in terms of their vetting processes and in terms of the culture of sexism that is allowed to fester unabated. So it's a great deal for us to be dealing with as human beings in a cross-party, non-party political fashion, not just in police and prisons, but especially, just to speak to what Anne said, prevention. It's a cultural problem. It's in terms of deep set, rooted, not just nationally, but internationally, sexism across and patriarchy across society that we need to tackle.
Thank you. Thank you all for your responses to that question. It seems there is quite a lot of common ground there, which is kind of reassuring stroke a little bit depressing as well. So the second question that I have that I would like to direct to Anne, if I may, is what lessons can be learned from local initiatives that could influence national initiatives?
I'm sure, Anna, there are some very good examples. I'm poorly qualified to say, but I think there are programmes going on in primary schools on the preventative front. I think the only thing I would add is that in an instance that, you know, Julie so movingly talked about, somebody has to be held to account. I mean, one of the problems when things fail is accountability. No one person is held. I mean, I take Jess's point that there are structural problems across the board, but, you know, senior people in all the services that get involved in issues where there is domestic violence, somebody does have to be held to account. On local initiatives, it has to be about school. It has to be on the preventative level, about looking at sexism, about bringing up little boys and little girls to understand how to resolve their conflicts, that anger is called out, that in the playground everywhere. But it has to be part of a movement, if you like, to say this is enough. We haven't got the resources, it would appear, to deal with it when it gets to the stage it did in Julie's family. But actually, we can do a great deal at the beginning of young people's lives.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the kind of prevention detection side of the argument. Jess, anything from yourself on kind of local national initiatives as MP for Yardley?
Yeah, so I mean, it's going to sound like I'm blowing my own trumpet terribly. Obviously, Anna has already mentioned the Nottingham pilot of misogyny as a hate crime, which has disproven all the naysayers of that, where it said, you know, the classic headline you hear if you talk about misogyny as a hate crime is that we're going to criminalise wolf whistling. Well, you know, most of the women I meet don't report rapes. The idea that they're just suddenly going to start all going to the police every time somebody wolf whistles at them is literally madness. For anybody who's ever made that argument, they deserve, frankly, to be pilloried as an idiot. But the reality is that what they found in Nottingham is that there has been this trust and confidence in the police that Shahar was referring to, that there has been a brokering of a greater trust in the police, that you'll be taken seriously when you report things in that area because of the adoption of misogyny as a hate crime, and that's very, very important. I suppose with regard to Birmingham, when I decided to stand for office, I stood on Birmingham City Council because it's like you say, it's not a party political. I don't love being a Labour politician so much that I would give up my job. I was raised. I need to actually say groomed to love the Labour Party by my family, but the reality is that all of my political activism has always been about returning an outcome for the people I was trying to serve. And when working in refuge, becoming a commissioner on the local council was entirely because I saw refuge funding being cut back and wanting it to be as important as the bins to the local council. So you've got to get there and make your voice heard. But one of the things that I did while I was there, and in one case it still only exists in that part of the country, is that in any commissioning decision about people, whether that's housing, whether that is welfare, whether that is anything to do with local services, you have to mainstream the idea that if you're working with people, you're working with victims and perpetrators of violence into every single piece of commissioning that goes on. And so when at the time public health was coming down into council's responsibility, which in my view is the right place for it to be, and the pandemic I think would tell you the same story, but we got to commission the services for sexual health and for substance misuse. And lo and behold, when the commissioning documents were sent to me, there was nothing about specific services for vulnerable women in substance misuse services. Yet one of the main problems with violence against women and girls is that people will self-medicate. And there was nothing about there needing to be specialist services in substance misuse for women needing to escape with their children into rehab, for example. And so we made it part of the commissioning document, and anyone who commissioned had to design a service. Similarly with sexual health, there was nothing about sexual violence in the commissioning document. Like, so you're a doctor giving out contraceptives to the same 17-year-old girl who's been in because she needs 4 abortions. You don't think that the question, is everything all right at home, is the first and most primary thing you should be asking. Like, that should be, these things need to be totally mainstreamed into every single thing that we do where there are people involved. And when Julie said it's not the landlord's responsibility, well, the law then should make it the landlord's responsibility, or licensing services on councils should make it the landlord's responsibility. So there is an organisation called DAHA, which is Domestic Abuse Housing Action, and they do accreditation because so many cases of landlords, it's being put down as antisocial behaviour on behalf of the tenant, when in fact it's domestic abuse. You're missing opportunities. Why on earth, when you're talking about social housing providers or any sort of landlords or licensing of landlords or whatever the law is around landlords, why on earth wouldn't you mainstream the idea that there are vulnerable people in those tenancies, and that there is a simple and basic question to ask of the, like, and it doesn't have to be like, you know, this idea that you shouldn't intervene is one of, it's been a perpetual problem for many decades, this idea that you're going to make it worse if you intervene. It's just not true. It is just fundamentally not true. And I don't have to go up to people and be like, is your husband battering you? I don't say it like that. I just say, is everything all right at home? I've had people come to me with housing cases and found that their daughter has been violently sexually exploited, because I know how to ask the questions. And it's not hard to find people. This myth, absolute myth, that victims of domestic violence are hard to find. Look at Katie. She was not hard to find. She was literally doing, she did her bit. She came forward. She kept coming forward repeatedly. And we can tell women to come forward over and over and over again. And ministers often do that. We want to hear from you. Please come forward. And it's just like, what's the point in coming forward when the services are not in place to actually, you open an enormous door into an empty room. And so you've got to mainstream in your local budgeting and your local policing and everything, mainstream the idea that if you work with people, you work with victims of abuse and violence.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm just mindful of the time, so I'd just like to go to Simon and see if we have any questions.
We have many questions. I would ask the panel if they think Holly's question about whether there should be specific funding attached to legislation is a good idea, but I'm going to guess that you're all going to agree with that, given the flow of the discussion. I guess the question that kind of comes through in the chat is thinking about this in a holistic way, about the connection between prevention, but also action to deal with offenders, but also thinking about the trauma that is caused, and some very useful and insightful comments from people in that chat. But the question that occurs that comes from this, and Siobhan talks about this too, is thinking about how do we get a wider societal buy-in to making this something that we take action on, that we can talk about legislation, we can talk about specific actions, but clearly part of this is about changing social attitudes and getting a broad base of support for making this something that we do something about and that we work to prevent as much as possible. I'd be interested to get the view of the panel about how do we go about that, given that law will take us so far, but not all the way. I don't know who would like to go first. Maybe Shahar.
Very happy to say something on that. I mean, you mentioned, and somebody I think in the chat is talking about, well, what do you mean by trauma? I just a very short story. I was a member of a jury trial some years ago now, and it was one of the worst offences imaginable. It was somebody in the dock who was being accused of serial child abuse and rape over a period of 10 years, some 20 years ago at the time. And it was very grueling, actually. And for the weeks that it went on, some of the jurors had to go absent, and it was risking having to commission a new set of jurors. But fortunately, that didn't happen. And we managed to convict him, actually, on all counts. And that takes some doing, actually, even within our jury system, because you need unanimity. And it was actually one of the most important decisions of my life, and I was clear and sure that he was guilty. And why? It's because we had a whole string of victims come before us, and there was no DNA evidence, but what we had the evidence of our senses, of the testimonies of those victims. And one of the main things that one of these victims wanted, and it was the ring of truth, really. They were asked by the defence, who was quite fierce, why they, what they wanted, because the perpetrator had no assets in particular. They said they wanted justice, and that was our role as jurors, to provide justice. And one of the husbands as well, which is why it's so difficult, actually, when we're being active bystanders, to actually know when somebody is the victim. One of the husbands also was asked, well, who told a story about coming back one day and his wife was on the bed and she was unconsolable on the edge of the bed. And then she explained what had happened those many years ago. And the husband was asked, well, why had she been hiding it for so long? And the husband said, you just don't get it. She was trying not to remember it. And then it all came out. So I think trauma is something which we have to put a far more resource into those services on the ground, and make sure that we are giving a proper psychological counselling support, which isn't just a lowest common denominator approach, which just looks at the number of people who are passing through. We have to make sure that we provide that support towards victims. And in terms of cultural change in society, that is a big topic. And just finally, I think one of the main areas now that we have to look at really seriously, and I know the online harm bill has this as an objective, it's going to be very difficult actually not to crack, but we have so much online abuse, which is disproportionately affecting women. I know, because I am also the target of abuse when I get involved in certain debates in politics. But I find, and this is ironic, but it's also symptomatic of patriarchy, that maybe women who are saying the same thing, none of us should be the target of harassment and abuse, are getting abused more. And we've seen also a spiral downwards of the standards in political debate. And that's been fueled also by no holds barred abuse going on social media. J.K. Rowling, for example, has been on the receiving end of it. So we need to also to speak out against that. It doesn't matter what one's political position. We have to call out abuse and harassment of public individuals and even people who aren't public and who are suffering in silence.
Thank you. Julie's going to make a comment when we finish the rounds, but first let's hear from Anne and then from Jess.
Thanks, Simon. I just picking up a little bit on what Shahar said. I think one of the problems for political parties is they're always looking forward to the next election. And so what they want to talk about is cheerful things. I get really fed up now I'm outside Parliament, seeing politicians with a fluorescent jacket and a hard hat on, you know, and they won't go out there and talk about domestic violence or gender-based violence, but actually that's what we need. We need politicians talking about this, because you will only shift the culture if they do. You know, I was involved in a case where an MP was sent to prison for abuse of a woman, and I noticed in the chat somebody was asking about misogyny in Parliament. Well, it's alive and well in Parliament. If the legislature, if Westminster, can't say the word tonight, if Westminster cannot set an example, then we're in a pretty sorry state. So it's about leadership, and it's about talking about it. It's about sending out the messages that this is an issue that bothers people in Parliament, bothers the leaders in this country. And until we hear that, we see it on our television, on social media, I honestly think it will be difficult to change the culture. It still feels like we are being run by a bunch of men who want to flout their masculinity and masculine attitudes, and I think that is very unhelpful.
Thank you. Jess. You're on mute, Jess, again.
Always. I think some of the men in Parliament wish that I had a mute button in real life. But I would agree totally with what Anne has said, and you know, she sort of stands apart of being one of the people who was willing to, like, you know, go against her own side with regard to the issue that she was talking about with regard to the MP who ended up on trial. But that is not a common thing. The thing about societal change that needs to happen, there is a couple of things, and it needs to happen in Parliament, and the example Anne gave is a very good one, is that society has changed. I want to be hopeful about this. Society has massively changed, and actually this is a really important thing. Whether it's the thing you'd cast your vote on or not is yet to be proven, and we've, you know, those of us campaigning on this have got to prove that by the next election. But people really do care about it, actually. And if you give a crappy response on something like this now, you'll regret it as a politician after about 5 minutes, and because you people do care. So well done, people, and everybody now knows, following Me Too, following Sarah Everard, everybody recognises now that all women have had a crappy deal, and that we have expended a huge amount of our energy and worth that we would offer the country if those are the terms in which we cared about. Actually, we take up so much bandwidth, violence against women and girls, and keeping ourselves safe and doing the job that the state or the society should be doing takes a huge, it's a lot of wasted energy of women who could be much more productive if we weren't having to deal with it. So that's another argument. But we've won that argument. Everybody knows that they know a very serious victim of domestic violence, know a victim of sexual violence, and know that pretty much all women have had at least some low-level disturbances for most of their life. Well done, us, we've done that. The thing that society has not woken up to, and until it does this, we won't change it, is that statistically speaking alone, if everybody knows a victim, then everybody knows and loves a perpetrator. And that is a much harder pill for society to swallow, because and Nadine Dorries did an absolute classic. And Nadine Dorries, I'm going to defend her. She's actually not. She's definitely one of the people who you would be fierce on these issues. And then last week, when a colleague of her accused Boris Johnson's father, Nadine Dorries went, "Oh, but he's a lovely man." Like, we make out like victims, perpetrators of domestic abuse are absolute monsters. And Priti Patel has done this a couple of times at the dispatch box. She's referred to Wayne Couzens as a monster. Now, who could argue Wayne Couzens is a monster? But by even using that terminology, we other the fact that these people live everywhere. They live in our homes, they work in our workplaces, they live on our streets. And until every single victim I ever met has gone, like, you know, to their mom or about their stepdad or to their mates, about their other mate, and they've said, "Are you sure you haven't misunderstood? He's such a nice bloke." Like, and we immediately put it on the victim. You've got something wrong. And so until society can swallow that particular pill, I'm afraid to say women will be left to do all the free labour in that regard. The other thing about Westminster, certainly, and people with power, is that still in Westminster, if you were to ask, I'm going to say at least 60% of the people in here, that the worst thing that they think could ever happen to a person would be to be wrongly accused of child abuse rather than being a victim of child abuse. And until the system catches up with the idea that the worst thing that could happen to you is to be raped and ignored, rather than for you to be questioned about being a rapist, is once again, we cannot understand the offender side of it. We cannot be, and that's human nature, to want to protect yourself in such a manner, to say, why doesn't she leave? Because I would, and it couldn't happen to, it won't be my son, it won't be my husband, it won't be my dad. We have to do that, and we have to blame the victim in order to protect ourselves, and we've got to stop it, because it's the fundamental problem in society that makes us feel for the offender and try and do what we don't want to ruin a young man's life. Well, it wouldn't be me ruining it. He ruined it himself. He made that choice. And that is the fundamental problem that society hasn't caught up with yet.
Thank you. There are many questions that we could follow up, but I'm going to hand back to Anna and to Judy. Please read the chat, because there is an awful lot going on in there.
Thank you, Simon, for that. Much appreciated. And thank you all for your brilliant responses on some of the questions asked by the public. It's really been very interesting, and I think quite challenging as well, in terms of, you know, what is there to do. I just want to ask each panel member now to sum up some concluding comments based on what they've heard, and I would echo what Simon said, to also have a look at the conversations that are going on in the chat box. And for me, that's what's been really good about this event as well, and that's what kind of this concept of activism is about, to get people talking, to get people to engage in this conversation, people who haven't met each other previously, to get gender-based violence around the kitchen table, for people to have it at the forefront of their mind. So it's really brilliant to see people chatting and discussing it in the chat box as this debate's going on. I'm going to start with Jess. Can you bring us some concluding comments on this, please?
Yeah, I mean, I would conclude by, in the spirit of hope, and somebody in the chat has asked for sort of what is one thing that could be done, just the very fact that Julie is on this call and talking to us about it is the spirit of hope and belief in horror that this can change, because what's the alternative? It's too horrific, the alternative. And we ask so much labour of victims and victims' families to prove the need. But there is hope. And if I had to pick one outcome that I would focus on, and that all politicians should have to sign up to, it simply is that by the next election, they have to prove with action or proposed action that the greatest harm, both statistically in almost every category that exists in our country, that it's a priority. And you can't just say it's a priority. You have to show in every single inch of your manifesto, whether not just on policing but on housing, on every single element, that we have to win the argument that it has to be a political priority. And to be honest, I think that we can do that.
Thank you. It's always good to end on a note of hope. And Julie, any response to the note of Hope? Any concluding comments for yourself?
I just firstly wanted to say thank you for the opportunity. I've been honoured and privileged to be part of this, and Jess, my goodness me, you've said everything I wanted to say, and I only got 5 minutes, so thank you. Just quickly on that societal change thing, absolutely, Katie. What I go and talk to people, because something Shahar said was he heard victims' voices. Well, my daughter's voice is gone, but I'm her voice, and we need to talk. Comments like this, conversations like this, you're absolutely right. The more we make it more difficult for perpetrators, you know, Katie was 21, beautiful, stunning girl, loving family, so many friends, hard working, not a drug taker, not your typical, and I'm going to do the typical, what you would expect a victim to be. If it can happen to her, it can happen to any one of us. And if it can happen to her, like you said, Jess, the perpetrators are everywhere. So I'm really hopeful that if we can all meet again in the next 12 months, which I think Anna was saying, I'm really looking forward to how these preventing the perpetrators and preventing all of this is going to evolve, and I'm so excited, and thank you for giving me some hope, because some days it's really hard. I am talking to you, yes, all of you really, but Jess, you've just said everything I wanted to say, so thank you very much indeed. I'm really touched. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julie. It's a privilege for us to hear you speak on such a difficult subject. I can't begin to imagine as a mum how you do that, and it would be great to have you all back. I think I forgot to mention that in my invitation, that you are now signed up to come back next year. But Anne, would you have any concluding comments for us, please?
Yes, just that like Jess, I travel my life hopefully, and it is better. It's not good enough. I think the only thing my conclusion would be is we have to retune our ears and eyes so we call things out. But before we can call them out, we have to notice them. It was only picked up by one journalist, and I think it was the Sarah Everard case, but apologies if I got the case wrong, where the judge talked about the victim being a wholly blameless victim, as if the victim could be blamed. And, you know, little things like that is what we have to retune our ears and our eyes to. Because if we do, then we can call them out. And I think we have to stop and think and look at everything we see and do and say, are we contributing by calling this out? Or is that person contributing to perpetuating the societal attitudes that exist? And when we spot things that are dangerous to that societal change, that stand as barriers to that societal change, we call them out.
Brilliant. Yeah, couldn't agree more, particularly on the victim blaming side. Finally, last but not least, Shahar, some concluding comments?
Yes, of course. I just want to pick up on what the fellow panelists have been saying. So firstly, yeah, I mean, this idea of wholly blameless, that betrays unconscious bias, doesn't it? Mm. And essentially, you know, one of the main lessons of the Rafiq racism cricket case is people standing by and not realizing that they were witnessing institutional racism. And when you also look at institutionalized sexism, it has the same quality. So what I would say as a take-home point is that we have to be, I mentioned being an active bystander, we have to involve ourselves. All of us will encounter completely unexpectedly situations in our everyday lives, and we have to not walk on by, but be actively involved. And finally, a point made by Jess, which I think could really do with amplifying, because it's absolutely brilliant. You know, it's a psychological and a philosophical point that these perpetrators don't fit a profile. They don't, you know, they just look like you and me. And, you know, Hannah Arendt understood this when she talked about the banality of evil. She doesn't mean that evil is trivial, far from it. She's talking about the ubiquity of evil and the way in which it gets perpetrated but within our institutions. And if we understand evil properly, because that's what it is, you know, this perpetration, it can happen to the best of us. And so these perpetrators, they're not, we shouldn't other them. They're actually, they're like you and me. And sadly, we could ourselves become evildoers, God forbid. And when we understand that, I think we understand also that anybody actually, unfortunately, can be a perpetrator. There's no particular profile that they have to fit. In fact, they could be hiding behind their normality, so to speak.
Thank you. I'm aware that we are out of time. I just want to make you aware that also in the chat box we have a document that details some of the work that I've been involved in gender-based violence in the Centre for Police Research and Learning Centre, and this is a centre as part of the Open University that looks at research and education to improve policing kind of for the public good. So research also plays a role in this area, and I'd just like to thank all the panellists for some really, really interesting questions around and responses to kind of that prevention, detection, and if we can't kind of fully fund the detection, then do we shift towards prevention, or how do we get that balance right, and how do we encourage people to take this seriously and take responsibility from a societal point of view as well? How do we instill that in people across everybody? So thank you, Anne and Jess and Shahar, and thank you so much, Julie, for joining us, and Simon for brilliant co-chairing. Have a great evening, everybody, and see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.